The Old Testament and Homer's Odyssey are among the most influential works of ancient literature. One tells the story of Israel's patriarchs and the foundation of biblical history. The other recounts the legendary adventures surrounding the fall of Troy and the long journey home of the Greek hero Odysseus. At first glance, these traditions seem to have little in common. They emerged from different cultures, different religions, and different worldviews. But when we look more closely, surprising parallels begin to appear. One of the most striking comparisons is between Jacob, the Old Testament patriarch, and Sinon, the Greek deceiver whose lies allowed the Trojan horse to enter Troy. Although one becomes the father of the nation of Israel and the other is remembered as the architect of Troy's destruction, both achieve their greatest victories through cunning persuasion and carefully crafted deception rather than physical strength. Their stories follow a remarkably similar pattern. Sinon stands alone before the Trojans. He appears to be nothing more than a helpless prisoner abandoned by the Greeks. He spins an elaborate tale, claiming that the massive wooden horse is a sacred offering to Athena and that bringing it inside the city will ensure Troy's protection. His performance is so convincing that the Trojans ignore every warning and pull the horse within their walls. That single deception leads directly to the destruction of the city. Jacob's story unfolds in much the same way. Instead of confronting his brother Esau through force, Jacob uses deception. With the urging and assistance of their mother Rebekah, Jacob disguises himself in Esau's clothing. They attach sheep fur to his skin to mimic Esau's hairy appearance. Jacob presents himself before his blind, elderly father Isaac, performing as his firstborn son. Isaac grants the blessing and inheritance that would shape the future of his descendants. Jacob is the younger twin who cannot match Esau's physical strength. Sinon stands alone before an entire city with no weapon except his words. Both rely on strategy, performance, and deception to overcome opponents who appear far more powerful. Their actions change the course of history. Sinon's deception brings about the fall of Troy, one of the defining events of Greek mythology. Jacob's deception secures his place as the heir of Isaac and establishes the lineage that becomes the nation of Israel. A single carefully executed deception becomes the turning point for an entire civilization. These parallels raise fascinating questions about the ancient world. Clearly, the biblical traditions have drawn from Greek traditions. Both cultures have drawn from shared storytelling patterns of the ancient epic of Gilgamesh. Each culture preserves similar archetypes of the clever underdog who triumphs through wit instead of strength. Each story reminds us that in ancient literature, history is not always shaped by the strongest warrior. Sometimes it is the most convincing storyteller who changes the world. If Jacob resembles the clever heroes of Greek tradition, figures like Odysseus or even Sinon, then his brother Esau occupies a very different role. He is not the strategist or the storyteller. He is the embodiment of untamed nature, a figure whose defining qualities are strength, instinct, and life in the wilderness. When viewed through the lens of Greek mythology, Esau begins to resemble not the hero, but the obstacles the hero must overcome. His closest parallel is the Cyclops, Polyphemus. The book of Genesis introduces Esau as a man unlike his brother from the moment of birth. He emerges first, covered in red hair, like a hairy garment, a vivid description that emphasizes his wildness and physicality. As he grows older, he becomes a skillful hunter, a man of the field. His identity is inseparable from the wilderness. He thrives beyond the boundaries of settled life, where survival depends on physical power rather than careful planning. The Cyclops occupies much the same symbolic space in the Odyssey. Polyphemus lives outside the world of cities, laws, and civilized society. His home is an isolated cave rather than a palace or temple. He is immensely powerful, but he possesses little of the wisdom, diplomacy, or foresight that define Odysseus. Like Esau, he represents the raw forces of nature, untamed, impulsive, and governed by immediate needs rather than long-term strategy. This contrast is exactly what gives the trickster his advantage. Odysseus cannot overpower the Cyclops. Trapped inside the cave, facing a giant capable of crushing him with ease, he survives only because he thinks faster than his enemy. Instead of relying on brute force, he invents a false identity, calling himself nobody, intoxicates the monster with wine, blinds him while he sleeps, and finally escapes by clinging beneath the Cyclops' sheep. Every step depends on intelligence rather than strength. Jacob's victories follow the same pattern. He never defeats Esau in combat because he doesn't have to. He succeeds by anticipating his brother's impulses and using them to his advantage. Esau returns from the hunt exhausted and starving. Driven by immediate hunger, he trades away his birthright for a bowl of red stew, a decision that will define the rest of his life. Later, Jacob disguises himself as Esau to receive Isaac's blessing, once again demonstrating that careful planning can accomplish what physical strength cannot. The similarities are striking. In both stories, the physically dominant figure is defeated not because he lacks power, but because he lacks restraint. Esau's impulsive appetite costs him his inheritance. Polyphemus' gluttony and arrogance leave him vulnerable to Odysseus' deception. Neither pauses to question the trap unfolding before them. This creates one of the oldest storytelling patterns in Western literature: civilization versus wilderness, strategy versus instinct, intelligence versus brute force. Jacob and Odysseus belong to a tradition of heroes who survive through cleverness. Esau and the Cyclops stand as their opposites, powerful, intimidating, but ultimately overcome because they cannot see beyond the demands of the moment. Seen this way, the rivalry between Jacob and Esau is more than a family dispute. It echoes a much older literary pattern, one found in the Odyssey and throughout the ancient world. The hero does not conquer the wild by being stronger than it. He conquers it by outthinking it. The parallels between the Old Testament and Greek mythology are not limited to their heroes. Even their landscapes seem to echo one another. In the ancient world, geography was never simply a backdrop for the story. Mountains, deserts, rivers, and distant kingdoms were symbols that represented the boundary between civilization and wilderness, the known and the unknown, the human world and the divine. When we examine the land of Edom, those symbolic patterns begin to look remarkably familiar. The name Edom literally means red, an appropriate description for its towering red sandstone cliffs and rugged mountains surrounding Mount Seir. This dramatic landscape stood on the southeastern frontier of ancient Israel, forming a natural border between the Promised Land and the vast deserts beyond. To the biblical writers, Edom was more than a neighboring kingdom. It represented a threshold, a place of separation and transition. Comparison of the symbolism finds an unexpected parallel in Greek mythology through Eos, the goddess of the dawn. Homer repeatedly calls her rosy-fingered dawn, describing the crimson light that stretches across the eastern horizon each morning. Like the red mountains of Edom catching the first rays of sunlight, Eos is inseparable from the color red. She exists at the meeting point between two worlds, where darkness ends and daylight begins. This shared symbolism goes beyond color. In the biblical narrative, Edom is presented as a divinely established boundary. As the Israelites traveled toward the Promised Land, they were specifically commanded not to seize Edomite territory, not even by a foot's breadth, because it had already been given to Esau and his descendants. Edom therefore became a sacred frontier, defining where one inheritance ended and another began. Eos performs an almost identical symbolic role in Greek cosmology. Every morning she opens the gates of heaven, announcing the arrival of the sun and separating night from day. She is the guardian of transition, the figure who marks the boundary between one state of existence and the next. Even the stories connected to these realms reveal intriguing similarities. Greek poets place Eos in the distant east, beyond the ordinary world. From this remote land she carries away mortal men such as Tithonus and Cephalus, removing them from their homes and transporting them to a realm beyond human society. In Genesis, Esau likewise becomes associated with a distant frontier. After separating from Jacob, he establishes himself in the rugged land of Mount Seir, where his descendants form the nation of Edom outside the covenant promised to Israel. Though related by blood, Edom remains a separate world. Seen together, these parallels suggest that both traditions use the color red and distant frontier landscapes to express the same symbolic idea. Edom and Eos each occupy the edge of the known world. They stand at the threshold between one realm and another, marking the boundaries of kingdoms, inheritances, and even the passage between darkness and light. In both the Bible and Greek mythology, the Red Land is not simply a place on a map. It is the symbolic frontier where worlds diverge and destinies are transformed. Biblical Esau's character seems to split into two legendary figures from the Iliad, Hector and Achilles. Each reflects a different aspect of Esau's personality and destiny, creating a fascinating bridge between the biblical narrative and Homer's world. Let's begin with Hector. Like Esau, Hector is the firstborn son upon whom an entire family places its hopes. Both men are raised to inherit honor, leadership, and the legacy of their fathers. Esau is Isaac's beloved firstborn, the son expected to receive the family blessing. Hector is the greatest defender of Troy, the crown prince who stands between his people and destruction. Both are also portrayed as deeply devoted sons. Esau enjoys a close bond with Isaac, while Hector's loyalty to his aging father, King Priam, is one of the most moving themes of the Iliad. Yet despite their noble character, neither man receives the future that seems destined to be his. Esau loses his birthright and blessing through Jacob's deception. Hector loses everything because of decisions he never made. It is Paris, his younger brother, who brings Helen to Troy and ignites the war that ultimately destroys the city. Hector spends the epic fighting to preserve an inheritance that has already been placed beyond his reach. In both stories, the eldest brother becomes the tragic figure. Neither Esau nor Hector is portrayed as wicked. Instead, they are men caught in events larger than themselves. Their strength, courage, and loyalty cannot overcome the fate unfolding around them. They become symbols of a vanishing world, watching the inheritance they were born to protect slip away. The comparison becomes even more intriguing when we turn to Achilles. At first glance, Achilles seems completely different from Esau. One is the greatest warrior in Greek mythology, the other is a hunter from the hills of Edom. Yet both are bound together by one of the most memorable symbols in ancient literature, the heel. Esau's story begins at birth with Jacob grasping his heel, an image so important that it becomes part of Jacob's very name and identity. The struggle between the brothers begins before either has spoken a word. Achilles, meanwhile, is remembered for the one place where he is vulnerable, his heel. Although later tradition develops the famous story of the Achilles heel, the symbolism remains powerful. The greatest warrior in Greece possesses a hidden weakness that ultimately determines his fate. In both narratives, the heel becomes far more than a body part. It represents vulnerability, destiny, and the fragile point where even the strongest individual can be overcome. There is another striking similarity. Esau and Achilles are both governed by overwhelming emotion. Esau returns from the wilderness exhausted and consumed by hunger. In that single impulsive moment, he exchanges his birthright for a bowl of red stew. His immediate physical need outweighs the lasting consequences of his decision. Achilles is driven by a different appetite, rage. His anger dominates the Iliad, shaping nearly every major event in the poem. When his honor is wounded, he withdraws from battle despite the suffering of his fellow Greeks. Later, consumed by grief and vengeance after the death of Patroclus, he unleashes a fury that culminates in Hector's death. In both cases, immense strength is accompanied by a lack of restraint. Esau's physical power cannot save him from his own impulses. Achilles' unmatched martial ability cannot protect him from the destructive force of his emotions. Their greatest strengths become their greatest weaknesses. This contrast also helps explain why Jacob resembles Odysseus far more than Esau resembles Achilles alone. The biblical story is not simply comparing two brothers, it is contrasting two ways of engaging with the world. Jacob succeeds through patience, planning, and deception. Esau lives through instinct, appetite, and immediate action. Greek epic preserves the same divide. Odysseus survives by intelligence, while heroes like Hector and Achilles embody courage, honor, and physical might. Seen together, these stories reveal an ancient literary pattern that appears across cultures. The strongest warrior is not always the one who shapes history. More often, it is the strategist who understands human nature, while the warrior hero becomes a tragic figure whose own strengths ultimately lead to his downfall.